There we go. Let's see if some more folks join. Otherwise, we'll just start. There are fair amount of things on the agenda. So. Okay. Well, we'll see if other people join. But yeah, it's the first meeting, so it's not that like public or whatever. It's in the community repo that we meet at this time, but we should do some more marketing for the next time. Okay. There we go. We're recording, yes. Hello and welcome to the first meeting of Workgroup Component Standard. Today, we're gonna go through the backlog and see what the scope of this SIG is, or workgroup is, as well as some of the backlog items and prioritizations for the next cycle. Okay, so the first thing I could go through is the workgroup infrastructure, and the meeting notes can be found in the Slack channel, but I'll also paste them here in the chat. Cool. So we got the approval from the steering committee and others to form this working group through the Kubernetes community pull request 3008 around a week ago. And we have got a label. We've got a mailing list created for us. We recently, some days ago, got the Slack channel. Now we have the Zoom meeting as of some half an hour ago or something when I created it. It's using SIG+ Lifecycle's Zoom account at the moment. And that's all fine. And we can have this kind of host key, it's called, so that we can rotate who is the host. pending stuff is creating a GitHub team. I opened a Kubernetes org issue for that here today. And what we hope to do, and the feedback we got from SIG architecture and similar threads was that they want to see a docs first approach for this, and that's really the plan. But before, or like in parallel with that, we will do a code first approach as well. So a lot of the feedback we got from the community poll was basically that this work group will mostly have the docs first approach, and will help split. We'll think about how to split the dependencies and packages and stuff for the component-based repo. But the component-based repo will in itself be owned by SIG API machinery, which owns kind of all the code we're dealing with today as well, and we're moving. So that totally makes sense. But yeah, for the record. And what we want to do is create or help facilitate creating KEPs for component configs to graduate to beta and higher. This is obviously a thing that will go through the API approval process, and like KEPs with SIG architecture and all the other API approvers. But still, I think we're gonna be involved in starting these processes and getting them actually done by coordinating with the actual SIG, like SIG node or SIG network. Then we already have a KEP for component base, and obviously we're going to work on that short term, especially so we get a sense of where we're going.
Yes.
But yeah, same. Hi. Cool. Great that you could make it.
Yeah, what's up? So what are we chatting about? Sorry, I'm a little late.
Yeah, no worries. I just went through the workgroup infrastructure, what we have, the Slack channel, mailing lists, labels, stuff.
Awesome.
And now I just said that we're gonna, although we're not gonna own the actual or care that much about the API structures of component config.
Yeah.
We're gonna probably be the ones that kick the process and like start the like, okay, let's make the kubeproxy component config go better. We'll create an issue for it. We'll create some kind of placeholder, whatever, Google Doc where SIG Network can come in and like say, hey, we want to make it like this, or whatever. But we'll help facilitate that thing.
Yeah.
And that fits well together with the docs first approach we should have like in this work group as a whole to think about these problems. And then we already have the component base KEP that's approved. The second, maybe the most important KEP going forward that we should create is the component standards KEP in itself. Like what kind of, as we run through these things and see where we're going with the component-based code and with other parts of the components, we're slowly going to see that, okay, this makes sense to have in every component, or like this is a good conformant component thing to have, whatever, like we could call it what we like, but still some kind of standard or foundation.
Yeah, I think we should be careful not to do too much at once with that. Like probably it's not one component standard KEP. Like there were a number of areas outlined in the original KEP, right? So it's probably like a KEP for like, this is the framework for flags and component config and that stuff. And that's like its thing. And then maybe there's another one for like config Z and another one for something.
Yeah, true.
So I think probably the first place to start is with the flags and component config one, and Stefan and I had already started doing some stuff at QCon for that. So
yeah, I changed the wording there to one or many.
Yes.
Because that's probably be many. Yes, so I think that's like on a high level the main goals of this work group, and I also just mentioned that although component base is owned by, like technically owned by SIG API machinery, we're gonna help with moving most of that code now to get going. But obviously, for example, Jordan and Clayton and other API machinery folks will have the approval rights and all that kind of stuff there as well. And we're gonna sync closely with them.
Cool.
And yeah, that's most for the infrastructure stuff. One thing I was thinking about where we should track all this backlog. I think it could make sense to have that in the component base issues list, just so we know where to put stuff. I don't know if you guys think that makes sense.
It's fine with me. As long as it's visible and we can search through it easily, that makes sense. I think component base issues, like that's a good place to kind of section them off from other things that makes them easier to search.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's kind of worked well with Cubatum as well. That we from the start had our own, or nearly from the start had our own issue tracker, because it's way easier to go through things there and prioritize.
I think let's just start with that.
Cool. Okay, so a quick run through where we are today with regards to merged PRs and stuff. We have, I'll paste this in the chat. We have 72.56.9 that got merged, that actually created the first component base or the component base repo. And this was basically, because earlier we had debated when doing the first component config refactor in 1.12, we had debated with many folks where we should put the shared types. For example, client configuration, client connection configuration, and lead direction configuration and stuff. And we just kind of threw this into both API machine and API server, and we weren't really sure where it would all fit. And that split didn't make any sense really at the end of the day. So now we actually have a dedicated good place to put it. If you're building a component config for a component, these are the types that are useful to you and are shared between. So this PR aggregated that into component base. We have the publishing bot, the staging bot working.
Do we know which components don't use those that should?
Sorry?
Do we know which components don't use those shared types that should use them?
The kubelet.
Yeah, I know that's one.
And
does kubeproxy use them?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the controller manager, but I think every other component than the kubelet uses client connection configuration, and the scheduler and the controller manager use lead direction configuration, which makes sense.
Yes.
So yeah, and cool. So where I want to get unblocked or whatever. So that's done, the PR, but Lubomir opened this PR which is API machinery related, and it's PR 71.58.9 that created a strict deserializer for the API machinery codec factory. And we got the feedback from Jordan and Clayton that we shouldn't expand the codec factory way beyond this point, which this does. So my other counter proposal was to just create the option. This is PR 72883. And this would only create this option, this strict option in the JSON serializer, which we'd then use in a dedicated config serializer package that we'd create inside of component base. So then we have our own more special, more scoped serializer for especially configs, which regards we want to load many kinds at the same time, maybe from different sources, and create helper methods so the components can use these really easily. Should be kind of no code at all involved at loading a config file from a source into the internal things. So I don't know. Do folks think this is a more viable solution to not expand the codec factory, but instead change the serializer, the JSON serializer, but have our own serializing package? Jordan, do you have any?
That seems like a much better starting point to me. I think the putting it into the main factory, expanding the surface area, and then some of the performance issues, like having to run everything multiple times back and forth, like that doesn't matter at all if you're consuming a config file once on startup, but it matters a lot if it's in like the main decode path or potentially in the main decode path. So like starting with something more scoped seems much better to me. And then getting all the various places that load config files running through a common config loader seems like a good starting point to me. So that pull is on my list to take a look at, but I think that's a much better starting point.
Yeah, I think it's just safer for us to keep that separate for now. It also means we don't have to optimize it, I think, is the main.
Yeah, and plus like Lucas said, we already had like 18 different ways we're constructing decoders. So like if we're talking about maintaining two, like the codec factory one and the component config loading one, I'd rather maintain two than one that is tuned for the API server and then 18 random special snowflakes.
Yeah.
Definitely agree.
Yeah. And Clayton had said on Slack yesterday that he might like the question we have with these, as we move code into component base, should we, before we know exactly what they're gonna look like, they're like Go code, public schema of the Go code, that is, before we know exactly how that's gonna look like, should we create an internal or experimental directory that's top level, and that then has the same directory structure for the code that we still want to change the whatever. Say we want to change this config serializer package to work differently. Is that of concern, or can we just say the whole component base repo is alpha for now, or whatever, experimental, until we've figured things out?
Or internal.
You've just described the conundrum that we have with all of the repos that we want to export. Like we haven't put in the time to think through how it's consumed to the point that we're confident that this is like the best API. And so until we take that time, we don't have a lot of confidence that like this works really well as an API for consumption. At the same time, our options are like put it out there and let people use it, or they go copy paste, write their own, and we have no visibility and no commonality in how people consume this. If we do put it out there and people start using it, and then later we figure out we want to change this, there was some flaw or some shortcoming, our options are fix that in a incremental compatible way, like add a second constructor or an option or something, or change it in a way that makes people react. So my preference, if the point of this is for things that load config to use it, I don't think I would start by fencing things off and saying, no, actually you can't use this. I would probably make the surface area as small as possible. So the smaller the surface area, the more likely we are to be able to adjust or improve or incrementally add to it in the future. And so I would, make the surface area very small. Ideally, you just pass in like a scheme that has your types registered into it, and you get back something that you can call decode on.
But Jordan, I think this is exactly the point. You are starting to refactor already in your head. And I'm not sure we want to do that with a lot of PRs we do in the beginning. You just want to move the code. And it would.
I thought there were like 18
shading.
different ways we were doing this today. So isn't unifying them going to mean?
Yeah, but the goal of this experimental is to have a two-step process to allow moving without byte shedding, and then talk about how it should look like.
Okay.
Yeah, but Stefan, this is actually kind of net new code. So that's
for
that's
this one,
why
it's different, maybe.
Yeah. But the other things we intend to, like Marek has a PR which moves the logs package, so that is more like just move as is.
Anywhere we already have like a unified component that we're using that just happens to live under API server, and we're wanting to get it into component lib. Yes, moving is fine. For something like the config loading where we're not actually strict and we need to be strict, and we're not actually unified and we want to be unified, as much as possible, just keep the surface area of the thing we expose small. That's all I'm saying.
That's makes perfect sense. Yeah. The way I wrote it, whatever proof of concept is like you pass in just the codecs and the scheme. So, and the codecs are created from the scheme. So that's all. And then I think we could add this to the scheme package or whatever. So it's really easy to use for the consumers. But yes, we do decoding of configs. We do in like a bazillion different ways today, and it's definitely not nice to look through the code. So so just like putting this all in one place and starting to use it from all other places makes sense.
Yeah, just having an easy common way to get a decoder for your thing.
Yeah. That's really and that has the options we like, the characteristics we want, like strict decoding.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And another common mistake or whatever is today is like we only support JSON or YAML in the places we decode. We don't support because there's some weird trickery around. So with having this one package, we can actually support both in a unit tested way. There's no tests.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I hope to proceed with this 7288.3 as soon as possible, and that all sounds reasonable. This feedback.
Cool. All right, I'll try to take a look at this within 24 hours.
Cool. So the next other bigger PR is we have 5 minutes left. Just want to mention this. Stuart has opened a PR that breaks out. Now we have the controller manager is, well, a set of many controllers, but the way we have structured the config is like this mega types.go file. And as we discussed with Mike and Stefan during KubeCon, this is not ideal because eventually, as we move controllers, as we break them out into different binaries or whatever, it makes it really hard for consumption. So what we want to do is, and also another, like, I should say first that we don't have a way to load a config today in the controller manager. So we don't have any backwards compatibility to think about at all, because it's just not possible to decode today. So the way we propose to do this that we discussed is by having every controller declare its own kind, its own deserializable and serializable type, which might be endpoints controller configuration or whatever. And that is local to the endpoints controller and has its own scheme, its own defaulting, everything. It's just super small and scoped. And then the controller manager, when loading all the things, it actually loads like 5 different YAML documents or whatever. And by saying, or 5 different files or whatever, 5 different sources. And in these, there's endpoint controller configuration. It's like whatever control, CSR, signing controller, and then it's composed in a way that it just has the add to scheme thing for every package or controller it imports. So then it starts to make more sense, and the Kube controller manager configuration would still exist, but it would just have the whatever is related to the manager itself. Does this sound viable?
I'd be interested to see how some of the things that could conceivably be set across all the controllers, like some of the client configuration, whether that would be set at the top level or whether that would be able to be tuned per controller. I know we've seen things in the past where, you know, a particular controller was doing more, and so it needed more, like higher rate limit options or something like that. But at the same time, like duplicating that across all the config structs, I'd just be curious to see kind of what the plan is there. If we can start small, but then have an idea how we could add some of those tunable things later if we needed to. The other question I have is if the goal is for the config to be such that if you wanted to run one of these controllers basically standalone, like the config would be coherent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So especially as we think about like splitting controllers up, moving them into separate binaries, recomposing them however we want, right? That's going to be a very interesting question to answer. In terms of, I want to move this controller out and still be able to specify that client information, or I want to run all these controllers together with the same client information, right? So
yeah, that's a really good point. I don't know exactly.
Just talking through, like, and maybe it's the kind of thing like when a controller gets pulled into controller manager, like the controller manager gives it its client, and so it's gonna do so based on like setting up a service account client for it. And when it runs standalone, like by default, it looks for an in-cluster config, but if you want to run it separately, you can explicitly give it a kubeconfig file. Like, I think there's some reasonable things we could do, but just kind of describing or thinking through, if you ran it standalone in cluster, if you ran it standalone out of cluster, if you ran it composed in controller manager, or you ran it composed in controller manager, but you needed to tune like rate limits for a particular one, like how would you express that? We don't want to make any of those like too insane.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's we're gonna try to keep these meetings short and focused. Right now, after this, the C cluster lifecycle meeting starts, so we have to end this. But we now have all the logistics, our infrastructure created for us, except for the GitHub team, which will be set up in the coming days. So starting to think about this, starting to create the KEP, like Google Documents or whatever, where we will explore these ideas will make a lot of sense and will be exciting.
I just have a very short shout out. I have this PR about flags open, so would like to get feedback for that. It's about wrapping the P flags that we can override config options via flags, similar to the kubelet, but in a different way.
Yeah, I think we should write a KEP for this, Stefan.
Yes.
And I think we should also include, go a little bit further and think about command building when we do that as well.
Yeah, but we have to end now, but that's cool. Let's keep it iterating on this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Yep.